Hi everyone. I've had quite a lot of comments on this channel accusing me of being ignorant or of denying the science that proves me wrong. It's never quite clear what I'm supposed to be wrong about. What, there's science proving men can be women after all? That people can literally be born in the wrong body? I looked through this channel's comments using a word search for science or scientific. The attempts from anybody to make any kind of scientific argument can be counted on the fingers of one hand, and the recommendations for specific things I should read or watch to improve my inadequate knowledge can be counted on the other hand. I mean, a lot of people make the same 3 or 4 recommendations. I've also had a few polite requests to respond to more recent videos making scientific arguments on this subject. So I want to try to deal with all these in the fullness of time. But the most common recommendation was for the article that appeared in Scientific American in 2019 entitled "Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Transphobia." When I first saw the title of this article after it was published 5 years ago, what I expected to see in it was an explanation of how exactly people are using phony science to justify transphobia, and what does the writer mean by transphobia. The writer is Simon, or Simon with E in brackets, D. Soh. For crying out loud. I'm not sure how to pronounce any part of her name, so I'll just call her Simon, and I apologise if I'm getting it wrong. Simon gives examples of what she calls dehumanising trans people, and that phrasing raises an immediate red flag for being borderline hysterical. But the examples given are like legal things that were happening in the US back in 2019 and earlier, like the then President Donald Trump's policy on trans identifying people in the military, bathroom bills, etc. She doesn't specify how phony science is used to justify these policies. Instead, she equivocates and leaves us to work it out for ourselves from the information she provides. She ends her introduction to the piece claiming that, contrary to popular belief, scientific research helps us better understand the unique and real transgender experience, specifically through 3 subjects: genetics, neurobiology, and endocrinology, and she's now going to tell us how. But I'm going to take them in a different order. Endocrinology, the role played by hormones, can be dispensed with quickly, so let's do that first. Actually, before I do, I should mention that what her entire argument boils down to is, well, I'll show you her conclusion. The sentence highlighted says, "The science is clear and conclusive. Sex is not binary. Transgender people are real." The second part of that looks like a non sequitur to the first part. Is she saying sex is not binary, therefore transgender people are real? Because if so, her reasoning, connecting the premise, connecting the sex is not binary to the conclusion that trans people are real, is missing. Why does sex have to not be binary for transgender people to be real? She doesn't define transgender people, but if we take what seems to be the most common definition, it's of someone whose gender identity doesn't match their sex. So a man feels that he's a woman and vice versa. Why can't they be real anyway? Or does she mean something else by transgender people? We're not told. But anyway, that is her argument, that sex isn't binary. And it's an argument we see coming up time and time again. Usually they call it a spectrum, though Simon doesn't. But it's never been clear to me why this is supposed to make the trans women are women, trans men are men claim any more convincing. And I suppose here I should make the obvious point. How can sex not be binary when there are only two sexes, male and female? Biologists define them by gametes, large and small, ova and sperm, two systems, two reproductive strategies. See how I've picked up the lingo. That is why sex is binary, categorical, and not a continuum, not a spectrum. So, hormones. I think it's pretty widely known amongst us lay people that both men and women produce both estrogen and testosterone. Both of these hormones contribute to many bodily processes, but estrogen is crucial to the sexual development and the reproductive health of females, and we do typically produce more of it than men, especially from the ovaries, but it's also produced in the adrenal glands and in fat cells. All of these locations also produce testosterone in women, but not nearly as much as is typically produced by men in their testicles. In trying to make a case against the sex binary, Simon says things like, all humans possess levels of estrogen, progesterone and testosterone with sex differences not as prominent as is popularly thought, and measurements of sex hormone levels in any one individual wildly vary, blah, blah, blah. The binary sex model not only insufficiently predicts the presence of hormones, but is useless in describing factors that influence them. So what? She says other stuff that I won't even bother highlighting because it's all irrelevant. Sex is not defined by hormones, and a woman with high testosterone is still a woman, and a man with low testosterone is still a man. They don't become the other sex. And again, what has any of this got to do with transgenderism anyway? I'm not saying that hormones are irrelevant to any discussion about the phenomenon of transgenderism or so-called gender dysphoria, incongruence, or whatever it's currently called. Not at all. The effect of hormones on the brain is undoubtedly relevant, or could be. It's a perfectly legitimate thing to raise in discussions. But I'm saying it's irrelevant to the argument Simon is making about sex not being binary. Enough said. Right, to go back to the beginning of the article, her first argument was about genetics. And before I go on, a shout out to Zach Elliott of the Paradox Institute, who has done a beautifully clear, as usual, 9-minute video examining the scientific points made in the article. I've still got a few things to say, but not too much that overlaps with what Zach says.
Stop using phony science to justify transphobia is another piece which uses the complexities of sex development and the diversity of sex differences to argue that sex is not binary. Let's analyze the argument with peer-reviewed science.
He's so calm. To put it another way, the article shamelessly uses the intersex gambit, which I have talked about in some detail in previous videos. Some people talk as if so-called intersex refers to a third category between female and male. Intersex isn't a category. The term is used wrongly to refer to about 40 differences of sex development, DSDs, most of which are sex-specific. They affect either male people or female people. And which of those DSDs is in any way relevant to transgenderism? Having an anatomical variation like, say, underdeveloped ovaries doesn't make a woman something other than a woman. It makes her a woman with a disorder of the reproductive tract. Now, I'm not going to revisit all this stuff. I've talked about it before. I just want to mention that the point that Simon's article omits, but which Zach Elliott highlights, is that the vast majority of people who claim a transgender identity do not have DSDs or atypical karyotypes. This 2011 study entitled Karyotyping, is it worthwhile in transsexualism? Found that nearly 98% of the 368 trans-identifying subjects had standard karyotypes, and concluded that karyotyping is only of very limited information in the transsexual population. Another ridiculous claim in the article I'd like to highlight is this one. Quote, "The popular belief that your sex arises only from your chromosomal makeup is wrong. The truth is your biological sex isn't carved in stone, but a living system with the potential for change." This is quite a bizarre thing to claim, and she does not support it. She goes on, biological sex is far more complicated than XX or XY or XXY or just X. XX individuals could present with male gonads. XY individuals can have ovaries, blah, blah, blah. A set of complex genetic signals, blah, blah, bipotential primordium and a gene called SRY. Sorry, Simone, you said biological sex has potential for change. That kind of sounds like people who produce small gametes can change into people who produce large ones. I mean, how? What she's giving us here is another non sequitur and a gish gallop, not an explanation, much less evidence for her daft claim.
I will say this categorically, that you cannot change your sex.
Your sex is indeed carved in stone, metaphorically speaking, yet she is seriously giving the impression that people can change sex. I'll bring in Richard Dawkins here. Actually, before I do, I want to show a couple of the stupid comments posted beneath the video I did reacting to Forrest Valkai. I have lost count of the number of commenters I've had saying things like this. "Prove you wrong about only having two sexes. You just have to read a biology book on the subject to prove you wrong." I asked which book he recommended, but of course he didn't answer. And this one. "Love it when people with only basic biology knowledge claim that there is only two genders." I think he might have meant to say sex there. "And then say that gender and sex are the same thing, so therefore there is only two genders." Of course, I haven't said that, and it really gets on my chest when people attribute to me a belief I haven't expressed just because I point out that there are two sexes and they are immutable. Literally, any proper biologist will tell you that even gender is on a spectrum and that being 100% male or female is actually pretty rare in genetics. And intersex is a real sex. I'm embarrassed for him. Actually, I've read quite a few biology books, including Ernst Mayr's classic, What Evolution Is. That was the first one I read since leaving school. I subsequently read most of Richard Dawkins' books, and about 20 years ago I completed an Open University course in mammalian biology, which included David Attenborough's lovely book, The Life of Mammals. I certainly wouldn't claim to retain a memory of everything I read, but I'm pretty sure that none of these literally proper biologists talked about gender at all, let alone it being on a spectrum, and they certainly don't claim that sex is anything other than binary. Now, Richard Dawkins, as you probably know, has had quite a distinguished career as an evolutionary biologist and zoologist, and he was Professor for the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. Earlier this year, he posted on X about Simon's Phony Science article, and he said this: "This ridiculous article, shame on the once great Scientific American, ignorantly misunderstands the nature of the sex binary," and he quotes the stand first, "Actual research shows that sex is anything but binary," close quotes. Sex is not defined by chromosomes, nor by anatomy, nor by psychology or sociology, nor by personal inclination, nor by assignment at birth, but by gamete size. It happens to be embryologically determined by chromosomes in mammals, and he mentions birds and reptiles and fish, but it is universally defined by the binary distinction between sperm and eggs. You may argue about gender, in quotes, if you wish. Biologists have better things to do, but sex is a true binary, one of rather few in biology. In a subsequent post, in response to a question about intersex, I won't read it all out, but it starts with, the way the non-binary faithful obsess about intersexes and about individuals who can't produce gametes amounts to a pathetic clutching at straws while they drown in postmodern effluent. I love it. Now, the next thing Simone talks about is brains, and she says, when the biology gets too complicated, some point to differences between brains of males and females as proof of the sexual binary. Nah, I don't think so. I mean, it's not clear who she's talking about here, but no feminist analysis cites brain differences as proof of the binary. There isn't a scientific consensus on the degree to which men and women differ in terms of how we think, how our brains are hardwired and for what, but I think feminists and conservatives alike recognise that it is our evolved reproductive function, or our God-given reproductive function if you prefer, that makes us two categories. And one of the daftest arguments is that sex is a social construct because we decided to create those categories. No, nature did that. Evolution did that. We just recognised the truth and named it, together in furtherance of a demonstrably harmful agenda that depends on erasing the boundaries between the sexes. Some people are in denial about it. Now, when it comes to brains, I've had so many silly comments posted on my channel. I'll highlight a couple of them. This one from a few months ago. First, there is some absolute nonsense about there being a scientific and medical consensus that trans women are women and trans men are men. The gender nutters quite often resort to that ridiculous lie and attempted appeal to authority, but I'll leave it for another time. Then we get, they checked the brains from organ donors that had the sex change surgery, and the trans men had male brains and the trans women had female brains. Who did? Who carried out this study? How can I find out about it? Or am I just supposed to take your word? Dream on. The reason I'm highlighting it is because it uses the phrase male brains and female brains as if a brain can have its own sex, which is different from the sex of the person whose head it's in. Here's another one, and this one has been posted twice on my channel. There was a couple of years in between posting, and I haven't read much of it because it's a huge block of text, as you can see, nearly 2,000 words without any paragraphs, which makes it difficult to read and which I take as a sign that it's probably not worth ploughing through anyway. And this would seem to be confirmed by the first bit, the first couple of hundred words, which I did read, and which refers to an unnamed doctor and his team and some research they carried out. Presumably they published a paper, but I am given no clue as to the title or any other information to help me find it. And he claims they found that the structure of the brain between a male and a female is as different from each other as night is from day. Note the word structure in block caps. He uses it 7 times just in that small passage and many more times throughout the whole of his essay. Okay, those are a couple of very typical examples of the kind of comment I get. I don't know who these people are. Maybe they are professors of neurobiology from Oxford or MIT or somewhere, but I'm inclined to think not. I do know who this guy is.
Completely impossible to reduce things like sex and gender down to a binary. Gametes can be gendered in this way. brains and bodies cannot. The point that I'm trying to make here is that even what you might call normal is a massively diverse group of people. We all live on a spectrum. And here's a fun fact for you. Trans people have been consistently shown to have neural architecture in these areas that matches their gender identity, not their genitalia. So for example, the BSTC is about 50% larger in men than it is in women. A trans man, so someone transitioning from female to male, has a BSTC that is the size of a cis man's. And similarly, a trans woman has a BSTC that is the size of a cis woman's. These are structural differences that cannot be accounted for with any amount of sexual reassignment surgery or any amount of hormone therapy. This is literally having a female brain trapped inside a male body or vice versa.
Got that? So, brains and bodies can't be gendered. We live on a spectrum, but some people literally have a female brain trapped inside a male body, or vice versa. I mean, which is it? Those are pretty contradictory, not to mention remarkably unscientific statements from self-proclaimed science educator Forrest Valkai. What evidence does he provide for male and female brains? The only relevant reference I can find out of his over 200 papers listed at the end of the video he made is the 1995 study, which I mentioned in the video I did reacting to Forrest, by Chiang-Ning Cho. It's pronounced something like that, not Zhu as I originally said it. Cho and his team found that the size and the number of neurons in the BSTC, that's the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, in the brains taken from 6 dead guys, trans-identifying guys, who'd been on estrogen, was typical for the size and neuron numbers found generally in control females, and this is seen as evidence of a biological nature to transgender identity. It's a bit much to say it is literally having a female brain in a male body. And this guy, Robert Sapolsky, is someone else I occasionally get told to read or to watch this video, which is a small part of a lecture. And in it he says pretty much the same thing as Forrest Valkai, but in a rather more long-winded way. But beneath this video, the only reference given is to the same report by Joe on the 6 dead guys. Why are they setting so much store by this 20-year-old paper? There have been maybe a dozen or more papers looking specifically at the brains of trans-identifying people since then. Now, to return to the Phony Science article, it so happens that the author of that piece, Simon, is, like Sapolsky, a neuroscientist, though, in fairness, only a fledgling, not a professor like him. At the time of writing the article, she was at the NYU Neuroscience Institute working towards a PhD in something to do with neuroplasticity. Interestingly, whenever I see anyone try to use the brain argument to suggest that some men are women and vice versa, they ignore neuroplasticity altogether, don't they, Forrest? And in the article she writes, "But a half-century of empirical research has repeatedly challenged the idea that brain biology is simply XY equals male brain or XX equals female brain. In other words, there is no such thing as the male brain or the female brain." Oh, yes, yes, yes. I love it when the genderists contradict each other. The research paper she links to is Daphne Joel's quite well-known study involving over 1,400 brain scans, so a few more than 6, on grey matter volumes in 116 regions in the brain on living people, which concluded that rather than there being a clear difference between male and female, our brains are a mosaic of male and female features with a wide range of variability between individuals. By male and female features, they were referring to those features that they initially identified from the first subset of brain scans. There were about 300 drawn from both sexes, that they narrowed down to 10 features that showed the largest difference between the brain scans taken from males compared to those taken from females. But when they mapped those results onto other subsets of their original data, they found only a very small percentage, less than 6% of their sample were consistently male or female. Quote, "Our study demonstrates that although there are sex/gender differences in the brain, human brains do not belong to one of two distinct categories, male brain/female brain. However, a later study referenced in the Paradox Institute's video focused not on grey matter concentration, as Daphne Joel's research did, but on the morphology of the cortex, the results of which suggested that someone's sex can be predicted with a very large degree of accuracy. I would have thought that the overall size of the brain would be a strong indicator of whether a brain comes out of a man's head or a woman's head, but what do I know? Only what I read, and I try to read widely. Having read widely, I can only say that the matter of whether and to what extent male and female brains differ is very far from being settled. For example, while Cordelia, who's a psychologist and neuroscientist, Gina, Rippon, I'll list these books below, they seem to argue that there is fundamentally no difference between male and female brains. You've got neuroscientist Deborah Soh, also a feminist, and she takes the opposite view. If the scientists haven't even established the similarities and differences in the brains of people of each sex, how can anyone say there are people with female brains literally residing in male bodies? And what is their point exactly? Are they saying that because of the size of something or the structure of something in the brain, these guys should be accepted as women, that in spite of their typically greater size and strength, they should participate in women's sports, that even the heterosexual ones should be allowed into women's changing rooms? Because if that isn't their point, then what is? The words virtue signalling spring to mind for some reason, and so does the word cowardice. One real scientist whose intellect and integrity I can respect is neuroscientist and assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh, Cale Edmiston, who in this video talks of the problems of relying on the existing studies of the brain, using neuroimaging techniques, comparing the brains of trans-identifying people to others, but they are all underpowered, fewer than 30 participants. There are statistical flaws, inconsistent results, and lack of replication.
There's just no way that those studies would get published in neuroimaging journals. And that's why a lot of them are published in sort of like sexology journals.
Edmiston is a trans-identifying woman, by the way. You know that dumb thing a lot of the cultists say about how would we police our public single-sex toilets, and are we going to have genital inspections as if men aren't obviously men in about 99% of cases? Well, how about having brain scans? I don't mean outside the toilets, but how many of those men who currently LARP as women and who insist they have the brain of a woman and the science supports it, how many would favour legislation that says, for example, that only those men in whose brains the BSTC doesn't exceed the size of the same brain part in a typical woman will be issued with a gender reassignment certificate or whatever, and be allowed to claim to be legally female? Would all these men, these heterosexual men in their typical blokey jobs and lifestyles, agree to it? How many would actually risk it? I'd love to know. Here's an idea. Accept that men aren't monolithic. You don't all think the same, you don't all feel the same, you don't all act the same. Some of you can't abide the cultural expectations of masculinity that are placed on you as men, and others of you have a fetish, or if you prefer, a paraphilia named autogynephilia. Some of you are straight, some are gay, some are bi, but none of you, not a single one of you, is a woman, and vice versa for the women who LARP as men. I'll leave it there. I promise to try to do more videos for my newly created science playlist, but I do have some other video projects I want to work on. So if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and bye for now.